Hey guys, it's Jason Snavely, certified wildlife biologist and founder and president of Drop-Tine Wildlife Consulting, the Drop-Tine Seed Company, and of course, Drop-Tine Podcast. Guys, I've 17 years private wildlife consultant, graduated from Mississippi State University.
All right, I'm going to interrupt that because we have a pile of information to get through today. I'm tweaking my mic here. I'm kind of blowing myself out. I may not sound it. I guess I never really sound tired, but I'm tired. And excited at the same time. I've been traveling a lot, hitting properties all over the place, and I'm just super excited about what we're seeing with our soil health and regen blends. Speaking of those real quick, everybody knows, I think at this point, that I'm not a big fan of social media anymore, and I'm not on it much. And I just really enjoy now connecting with people again like we used to over the phone and with meeting requests. But I will throw this out there. Spring reload, we've actually quadrupled the tonnage, the volume sold this year, which is so cool for me, not just from a business standpoint, but because now I know there's so much more out there on the ground. And the neat thing this year was I was able to see some properties that have 2 and 3 years, actually three plus years of the regen soil health method under their belt, and the responses and reactions are absolutely amazing. So we'll keep selling spring reload through the month here. Today is April 20th, 21st, somewhere in there. And typically around May 5th or so, I shut down spring because most of you hit those soil temps where you're 60 to 65, and it's time to get the summer reload in the ground. So if you do want to get some more spring reload, hurry up because we are about to shut that one off. So anyway, moving on. This particular podcast I have been wanting to do, as one of my 2 guests just reminded me, since late 2018. I do not get to do as many podcasts as I want to. One of these days when I can, slow down in the field, I will record a lot more. But this podcast is going to be an absolute blast because it's I keep research briefs for myself with the latest and greatest science on all major topics that my clients bring up and that I talk to them about. That just allows me to track back to sort of the beginning of that particular topic. And this one is a great one. We've been trying to nail down a time and date, and it has been since late 2018, and I'm not joking on that. So with that, if you guys can do me a huge favor, this particular guest did not pay. I did not supply them with any questions ahead of time. They're not a partner. They're not a sponsor. This is strictly 110% to set the record straight and to educate, which is primarily what my company is, an education company that just happens to be in the private sector. So if you could go on to the app and rate and also leave a review, preferably a very good review and a very good rating, we would appreciate that. That's what drives me. And without any more, so aging white-tailed deer. Today, that's what we're talking about. Specifically, not so much aging on the hoof, which is fun, but we're talking about aging using 2 processes, primarily one, which is the more accurate process. So why do we need to accurately age deer? I have a note here in my notebook. We absolutely must be able to accurately age white-tailed deer to manage them the way that we manage them. And by the way, I'm talking intensively managing whitetails to maximize not just harvests, but observation rates of, extreme rut activity, fighting, scraping, rubbing, tight sex ratios. And then obviously, when you look at antler size, I don't think it's a secret anymore that antlers, on the average, typically tend to increase with age. We like to look at antler variation within the same age class, antler variation across age classes. And then, one of my favorite things is to look at the effects of selective harvest on nutrition, and nutrition on antler size. And then also, why else would we want to know the age of a particular buck or maybe a subset of bucks from an annual harvest how do antler restrictions, how could antler restrictions, I should say, potentially result in perpetual protection of a specific buck, or on the flip side, high grading a herd? We use age data to help us design multiple criteria slot limits, which is something that came to my mind while sitting in an undergrad class at Mississippi State, listening to a fisheries biologist, Dr. Schramm, talk about slot limits, and why I thought to myself, why won't this work in whitetails? And obviously we need some sort of size and age association to do that. And then perhaps, more common to most of you, we need to know the age of animals to assign specific harvest data to track our management efforts, right? So, a live weight or body weight of any whitetail is great to have when I roll up to a property, but if they have associated reliable age data to go along with those body weights or lactation rates or antler measurements, that reads like an open book and allows me to do, and other biologists and managers to do our jobs so much better. So I'm going to go ahead. I've got a whole process here that I want to go through on this podcast, but so you don't have to listen to me ramble the whole time. I'm going to introduce our guests right now. I'm hoping that they're still with me. I'm sitting back in Pennsylvania. They are sitting in Montana, the great state of Montana. So with me today, Miss Carolyn Nistler and A.J. Stevens of Matson's Lab in Montana. You guys still with me?
We're here.
We're here.
Excellent. I didn't put you to sleep yet, did I?
I'm just waking up.
Yeah, you're a little...
I got coffee, so I'm good. No, that was great. Jason.
We're all good, yes. Thank you very much. Thank you for having us.
Absolutely. Thanks for being patient with me. And it took, I like to have people on the podcast who, and it's not a requirement, but maybe haven't necessarily been on a whole slew of other podcasts. There's a lot of recycling of material and guests, and there's a lot of good guests, so they deserve to be and should be recycled. But you guys let me know that this is your debut, you're rookies at this, and that surprised me because your lab and this technique absolutely need to be mainstream with hunters and deer managers. So I'm super excited.
Great. Well, we concur. We're likewise excited, and I couldn't agree more. We'll obviously talk about our analyses that we do here at the lab, but we have been around for a long time. But outside of the world of, agency biologists and researchers, there's a lot of folks that still don't know about what we do here. So I'm really excited to reach out to your audience and anxious to see what sorts of questions we have and what kind of answers we might be able to provide.
Absolutely. I love it. So without getting into too many of the details, if you can kind of give us a bit of a background on what Matson's Lab. I know in 1969 Gary started the lab, and I'm going to start in 1949 with Severinghouse's study. Is that how you pronounce it? I've never heard anybody else pronounce the 1949 eruption and wear study. Is it Severinghouse?
Yeah, as far as I know, I've only read it.
Okay.
So
yeah, that's.
I don't know the correct pronunciation, but yeah, absolutely. And Gary comes sort of on the heels of those folks, and he's one of the original pioneers of Cementum analysis in the 60s, and so he's really been the leader in the industry. Been very familiar with Matson's Lab as a wildlife biologist. Just for a little bit of background, before I got started doing this sort of work, I worked as a both federal and state biologist, hunter education, bow hunter instructor. I shot on the Bowtech Pro staff, so I'm a hunter and a conservationist as well as a laboratory scientist now. And we absolutely love what we do. AJ might be able to chime in a little bit on some of his background, but for us, this is the perfect pairing of science and conservation. Yeah,
and so just for me, my background, my background is more in the laboratory science field, so I spent 5 years working for a large contract research organization, got quite a bit of lab experience, and then, like Carolyn said, I'm also an active hunter, so originally from Ohio and just pursuing whitetails and turkeys, growing up, and that was always a joy, and it was something I was always kind of fascinated by was, the idea of harvesting a buck when it is in its prime. Specifically, hunters typically want to shoot the biggest buck we can. And so, I was always looking at the teeth and trying to age them. And like you said, it's kind of hit or miss, especially we had properties in kind of north central Ohio and then also in southern Ohio. And just the difference in diet between those two regions, it seemed like aging them based on the molar wear was always kind of, left more to be desired. And so I was able to join here with Carolyn in 2015 and make my way out to Montana, which was kind of a lifelong goal. So it's been, like she said, I think it's been a perfect fit. It's very rewarding to be able to provide the data that the biologists are using to literally manage our game populations. And so it is interesting. This is our first kind of podcast, and I think that what we do, a lot of people will find interesting. And I think Carolyn said it, and you said it, we've been around for over 50 years, and we're kind of behind the scenes. People, I don't think, have realized what we've done, but any large game management that incorporates ages over the last 50 years has almost certainly used Matson's laboratory to process those teeth and assign the ages.
Holy cow. AJ, you nailed it. And I wrote a bunch of notes from that one comment, and you went so many different directions. I do want to say again, if it sounds like, I'm being sponsored by Matson's lab, you guys can attest that I'm not. As a sciencey, nerdy guy, the only Cementum lab I can ever recall being in the literature was Matson's lab. And it's funny, there's I don't know if it was the Hamlin study or one of the studies kind of says, well, and they start quoting all the statistics. And I'm sure you guys will tell us today how many whitetails you're up to. At one time it was 20,000 and then 80-some thousand. And now it's, I'm sure, exponentially greater than that. But
yeah, it's 345,000 through December of 2020.
Yeah, that's a pretty good sample size. Yeah. But and everywhere in the literature, I guess my point is Matson's lab pops up. And if there are other labs out there, and I know there are, I've spoken to a few over the years. But for me, when I see scientists and researchers using a particular lab over and over again, I don't want to guess. I want to know. So I'm going with Matson's. But anyway, we'll get into some of that later on, some questions I have for you. But I kind of want to back up a little bit. AJ, you kind of mentioned some of the lower mandible, the lower jawbone aging. And I've always had this, I guess, head trash about aging. So when I went to Mississippi State in the 90s, late 90s, I had big game ecology, I think, with Dr. Steve Damaris. And then wildlife techniques, and I'm sure, Carolyn, you've had the same courses. And, we had labs where we had X number of known age jawbones, primarily from whitetails, some muleys. And we had to literally go around and, jawbone number 1 is 2.5 and go through that tooth eruption and wear process, which seems quite elementary when you sit down and study it and learn it. And I can remember being in Dr. Damaris's class and feeling the pressure to get all, I think it was 20 or 30 jawbones correct, because I was the deer student. I was the one, working in the deer pens, and I was always, always had my nose working with the grad students, and that was just my thing. So I did it. I aced the exam and felt very comfortable aging whitetails using, obviously, Severinghaus's 1949 research. So a little bit about that, and I hope I'm not droning on, but in 1949, which is 72 years ago, Severinghaus published this paper, and I think it was from New York. I think his data were from New York, basically saying, hey, I think the title was Tooth Eruption and Wear. Tooth development and wear as criteria of age in white-tailed deer. And I've always had this paper around just because it was kind of a landmark paper. But it was almost misunderstood from the very beginning, in my opinion. So Severinghaus, and then some others. There was some follow-up work by Robinette in 57, and I think Quimby and others in 57 looking at muleys and elk. But they always followed this up with, hey, listen, tooth eruption and wear is accurate when aging deer up to 2 years of age, but you should expect some reduced accuracy for older animals due to, and AJ, you just hammered it, individual variation in wear patterns, and that could be because of diet, genetics, or whatever. And then variation of experience with biologists, and I'll kind of laugh at some of my fellow peers when I talk about the Ken G study and John Holman, two really good biologists. But so this original research in the 40s obviously said, hey, listen, this works up to 2 years of age, but once you get over that, you know what, you kind of lose accuracy. And to me, that's a little bit intimidating. I don't want to do that. So. I've kind of, ever since I read that paper and then took my labs, I've always had sort of this head trash again that, how do we know this is good? And then you find out that they actually aged. Carolyn can probably correct me here. I'm going off of memory. I believe it originally came from marine mammals. Is that right, Carolyn? In the 50s, just after that, where they started realizing that we could look at rings in the cementum of root tips. I think it came from marine mammals, right?
Yes.
Yeah. And then there were some other biologists, and I, by the way, I've just pulled out my research briefs that I keep. One of my professors taught me how to do this, that I keep for my consulting, because I like to remind myself what the chronological order of this is. But there was then Lowe and Gilbert in the 60s, like mid to late 60s, who then said, hey, look, we can look at the rings in the cementum, and we'll get into some of these big technological terms here, of the root tips of incisor teeth of mule deer and whitetails, and that they are in fact related to age, especially in northern North America. And we'll get into some of the regional differences or variations as well. So I guess with that, I'll stop. That's kind of my first part of my talking points, and I'll let you guys hammer on some of those thoughts.
Sure. So I suppose, I think that in the field, absolutely, lots of folks are going by jawbone and tooth wear. And, particularly in a closed population or somewhat closed or privately managed population, I think that most managers have a good enough idea of the animals in their area that you can be relatively accurate on a small piece of land for a limited population. But the problem is you get used to the animals on your land and how they grow and they develop, and then you move to the other side of the state. And those animals, their nutrition's completely different, their genetics are completely different, their antlers are going to be totally different, and all of a sudden you're not comparing apples to apples anymore. And so that's one of the places where Cementum age analysis can kind of level the playing field. And you're absolutely right. After about 2 years of age, you can't rely on tooth eruption. Tooth wear is wildly variable based on feed and region. I mean, we can tell the difference in a eastern Montana deer versus a western Montana deer in about, probably fractions of a second by tooth wear, just because there's so much silica and grit in the soil and in the plant life in the eastern part of the state. And we don't have that in the western part of the state. Granted, Montana is a huge state, but that's just kind of a really good example of why we need something more than just tooth wear. And luckily for us, we can do that just in-house. AJ, do you want to?
Yeah, I think, just to kind of hit back on what you were saying there at the beginning about the Severinghaus paper, the eruption would probably be definitely an accurate way, or it is an accurate way to age deer up to 2.5 years old. And that's actually something that we can use here. If we do, because we're getting, such large populations of animals, we do get a number of young animals, and we will use that to age them before we actually even put the tooth into the process. And so just knowing when those different teeth erupt can be a great indicator. Obviously, with a very young animal, if it's a fawn, you're probably going to know that or half, 6 months old typically at the time of harvest. You're probably going to know that just by the body size. But another way to confirm that is they don't have their permanent teeth in, so they're called deciduous teeth, or you can think of them as baby teeth. So if you open the jaw and there's baby teeth in there, then it's obviously from a very young animal. But yeah, Carolyn kind of hit that on the head. The wear pattern, or the molar bar wear, is very variable, and I think it has its place. And like she was saying, if you have a very small property or even a good sized property, if it's local and you get to know it and you're intimate with it, and what we've actually had clients, and I think this is a great application to cementum age analysis, is if you're managing your own 40 acres or 400 acres, and you're taking you took a buck this year and you take a buck next year. Well, over years, you can send those teeth into us and we can age them, and you can save the molar bars, and you can develop a pretty accurate molar bar specific to your population. There's still going to be inaccuracies with that, but I think that that's probably a good idea for maybe some individuals to pursue. Another way I would kind of think of it, is you're trying to teach from listening to some of your other podcasts. I think you're encouraging people to age deer on the hoof. And so, once you get the deer down, you could take a look at the teeth and get a pretty good idea. And then I think sending the tooth into the lab is going to give you the best age estimate that you can get. And so you kind of have those three kind of steps, age it on the hoof, age it with the molar, and then you can send the tooth into the lab.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Absolutely. And that's actually one of, I'm kind of getting ahead of myself, but since you addressed it, which is perfect, I encourage all my clients to, use trail cam surveys, trail cams to, obviously gain photographs, capture and pictures of individual bucks. And then, aging on the hoof is fun. It is. And it's just another one of those tools, but it's a property specific tool. So you become better over time. You make mistakes. Those are our expectations going in. But if you, let's say you age a particular buck at 4.5, and maybe that's kind of your green light, you harvest him, you find out, oh shoot, based on Matson's analysis, he's only 3.5. Well, that's sort of a recalibration opportunity. And, as much as I'm going to down talk the lower mandible, Severinghouse's 49 study and that methodology, I still pull them all and make them look pretty and hang them up with the trophy, where there's also a plaque or, something that also has the cementum age from your lab along with it. It's just fun and educational. And we've had both hunters and non-hunters, and having kids, it's really neat watching and listening to my kids try to teach their friends, hey, this particular buck is, or these 3 bucks are 4.5, and this one here, we thought he was, 5.5, but turns out he wasn't. And that's pretty neat. But so I guess going back to some of this research, there was a period of time where some researchers, I guess maybe in the 70s, said, okay, we need some more, we have too many questions, and we need to do some more research to prove that, these particular techniques are accurate and inaccurate, whatever. The scientific method, right? And of course, researchers are inquisitive in that regard. So I'm going to backtrack quick to when I studied. So in the 90s, and I know, Carolyn, you had the research, what is it? Research and management techniques for wildlife and habitats. This is kind of like one of the first textbooks you pick up. And it's always been my Bible, to be honest with you. It's a great book. On the sexing and aging, or in the sexing and aging chapter, they get into, aging game birds with, with their wings and sexing and the whole 9 yards. And obviously they get into jawbones. And I can remember studying this, taking the exams, doing well, and later finding out that there was a misprint. I think I got an announcement from the Wildlife Society that said there was a misprint in the 5th edition, which is the one I learned from, that they were teaching us to age a year off, and I can't remember which way. And I kind of found that was interesting. That was funny. But before that, I was at a Southeast Deer Study Group meeting, and Ken G., who is an excellent researcher, and John Holman from Oklahoma, did what I call the Oklahoma study. And I pulled it out and I'm looking at my highlighted notes because I couldn't remember all the details. But essentially, these guys wanted to validate tooth replacement and wear for aging white-tailed deer. Again, going back to the Severing House study, they're in south central Oklahoma. So they took 106 known age jawbones or dental casts. That's a pretty good sample size. And found that they could comfortably categorize them into 3 age classes. How did they do this? They went to 34. This is great. I share this with clients all the time. So you'll hear guys say, yeah, I killed a 3-year-old or I killed a 4-year-old. And I'll say, really? How did you determine he was 3 or 4? And, they'll go down through. Maybe they pulled the jawbone or the taxidermist told them or whatever. So G and Holman took these 106 known age jawbones, handed them out to 34, not just hunters, not just taxidermists, but wildlife biologists who were trained on this methodology. And they said, all right, let's see what the experts do. Let's see how well they do. Unannounced, great science, just handed them out. And they found that they failed 60% of the time, which means a 40% success. I don't like those odds at all. Obviously, most of the failures occurred at greater, at that 2.5 plus or greater than 2.5 plus. So basically what they said was, hey, listen, we can comfortably categorize fawns, yearlings, and adult in those 3 categories. But as far as getting into this 3.5, 4.5, 5.5, 6.5, using the eruption and wear method, it's a no-go. Do you guys have any comments on that research? Or I can remember when that came, I remember watching them do it, and when the results came out, I was floored after learning
those
about
numbers. I don't specifically remember that, but I am not surprised at all by the figures that you just cited. That's sort of common knowledge that eruption wear patterns have a pretty large sort of error source. Mm-hmm. And 40 to 50% is kind of what we usually think that we're dealing with when we're trying to age animals that way. Again, particularly the older ones. That doesn't mean that you can't get close that way. And even with Cementum age analysis, when animals get old, in the teens, they're difficult to age. And I would imagine that we've got a larger source of error in those older animals. There is some source of error associated with everything that any human does, but it's definitely more accurate to use Cementum age analysis, and our accuracy rates for the big game species that we're most familiar with range from anywhere 85 to about 96% accuracy. So it's quite a bit better than WAG, a wild ass guess. So is tooth wear, it's better than just guessing, but here's a way to even kind of close that gap a little bit more.
I'm so glad you brought up the swag, because I was going to do that. And that's kind of, clients ask me, is this accurate? Or here's a jawbone they shove in your face. Can you do this? And I say, yeah, if you're game with a swag, and they just look at me like, what? A swag is a scientific wild ass guess. And they say, well, you must not be a good deer biologist. And I say, no, that's probably true. But more so, I just don't believe this system's 100% accurate. But I will take a stab and give you a swag. So I noticed the bottom part of you said 85+% accurate. And that kind of, I know I'm a study nerd when it comes to this stuff. But the Hamlin study, which A.J., you actually emailed that to me, and I already had it in my aging folder here, all shredded and highlighted. But so just real briefly, Hamlin, those guys and gals, I think, there was another Carolyn, not you in there, but there was a different Carolyn.
Yeah, Carolyn's fine.
Yeah, so Hamlin et al., they looked at elk, they looked at whitetails, and they looked at muleys. We'll focus on the whitetails. But basically they said, all right, let's compare these two methods. And I think they were 85.1, I'm looking at it, 85.1% accurate with known age on Cementum aging, and then 42.9% using the lower jawbones, I think it was. Yeah, for whitetails. So, and by the way, elk, which blew my mind. I thought elk, and you can maybe address some of this because there are probably quite a few elk hunters listening. I thought elk were easier to nail than whitetails, but they actually, for elk greater than 5 years old, they actually averaged 16%, which is pretty bad. So yeah, good study.
Yeah, well, thank you. I had absolutely nothing to do with it, but I did know Kenny Hamlin at the time he was doing this work. I was actually a student at Montana State, and got to ride around with him while he was working on it. So it's kind of cool. I had no idea then that 20 years later I would be doing this stuff myself. But as you can probably attest, Jason, if you're in the field and long enough, you kind of keep running into the same people over and over again. In fact, I'm surprised that our paths haven't crossed in the past. But it's really cool to see some of this stuff come around and now be, relying on it every day. And I had a number of friends that worked in the wildlife lab, and they pulled teeth, and I remembered stopping by and, checking on them and thinking, this is what you do for a job. This is really weird. And now, we're doing this weird science every day. So it's cool, and we really enjoy our jobs here.
It is cool. It is cool. And you know what's funny, something I'll inject here is a lot of my clients, or most of my clients and peers and friends, are big-time hunters, and they're all fans of the Cementum annuli technique, aging analysis, and so I call it the Cementum season. So you have the hunting season, and then typically March, right? April, maybe, depending on how they were sent. I'll start getting text calls and emails from clients who finally got their results back from your lab. And it's great because the educational, the teaching moment, right? The educational opportunity is enormous. So they say, hey, remember that buck I killed? And yeah, of course, here's what he turned out to be. And then that's when the fun conversations start. So, in fact, I just got one a couple of weeks ago. A client's teenage son killed a buck that they absolutely 110% felt was a 4-year-old, and turned out to be 3.5 years old, with 90+% certainty. And we'll get into the whole A, B, and C confidence rating here soon. But and it was cool. We talked about, hey, listen, it's been 12 years, I think, maybe even longer, that we've been working on his property, and this is a Pennsylvania property. Intensively, he's 100% invested and vested in this property. I think we are seeing some maternal effects. In other words,
it shows that what you've been doing is working.
Exactly. So you get these epigenetic sort of effects, maternal effects, where now our 3-year-olds are sort of expressing and showing as 4-year-olds and maybe even 5-year-olds. So that's fun. But I wanted to touch on something in the Hamlin study before I move on. He noted a tendency to, and I'm quoting this, consistently overage young animals and underage older animals by the wear technique. So I thought that was interesting. And for me, I don't really want to underage and overage. I want to be as accurate as I can be.
Sure.
Yeah. One thing I will add to that study is, you mentioned those numbers, 42.9% for the wear for whitetail, and then 85.1% for Cementum age analysis. So I think that speaks volumes right there. Looking at that, typically on a given study like this one, we're probably going to be twice as accurate. However, there's that 15% there that we're going to be off. And one thing, I don't know if it mentions it in this study, but we've found over the years is when we're off usually almost certainly by 1 year. So it's not going to be, a difference of 2 or 3 years. It's going to be a minor difference. But there is, at the end of the day, we do provide age estimates, but this is the most accurate way to estimate the age of your deer. And then just backing up a little bit further, I wanted to touch on what you were mentioning with the molar bar aging. You talk about age class versus age. And so it depends on what your management goals are. If you're just wanting to know how many deer you have over 2 years old, molar bar aging is probably going to be fine. But when you want to start figuring out, are you harvesting the deer when you want to harvest it? And if that's 5.5 or 6.5 years old, Cementum age analysis is absolutely hands down the way to go.
Bingo. So I have this circled in my Hamlin study also. I said one more thing, but I sort of mentioned the fact that there might be sort of this region in the country where you lose I guess accuracy, and Carolyn, I'll let you kind of run with that one. But I can remember, so my son, who's 14 now, got absolutely purely 100% shitty lucky and drew the White Sands Missile Range Youth Oryx tag, not once, but twice 2 years in a row. So him, myself, and my daughter have been able to do that 2 years in a row, which they still tell people is their best overall vacation period ever. So I'm kind of proud about that. But I can remember talking to the biologists out there and saying, man, it's a shame, because when you look at these animals, cows and bulls both have horns. You kind of have a hunch, of what the age is, but you really don't know. And I remember saying to one of them, man, it's a shame you couldn't run Cementum annuli on these and find out how old some of these are, because on the missile range, it's, they kill quite a few, but it's very, as you can imagine, the security's pretty tight and you can kill some old critters. And then we talked about the region not being able to lay down. I know we said we would save the sciencey stuff for last, for those who want to learn about, these rings and how it works from a procedure standpoint. But so can you touch a little bit on, so if, here I am in Pennsylvania, AJ mentioned Ohio, you guys are in Montana, Texas, Georgia, Florida. Should I just turn this podcast off and listen to another political podcast and get angry? Or is it still going to work in Georgia?
Oh, no, you should keep listening to us. It'll still work in Georgia. The problem, if you will, maybe it's not as problematic as it is challenging, is in those southern climates, right off the bat, you don't see those seasonal influences that's causing that disruption in the growth pattern that's causing those really regular rings, as you said, those cementum layers in, mule deer buck out in eastern Montana that's just scrapping its way through life. In Georgia, before anybody plants the food plot or is protecting the deer, they've already got a lot less stressful environment. So they're a little bit more difficult to see those patterns in the growth layers. And then add something like supplemental feeding or minerals. And as I'm sure you're aware, people are doing all kinds of crazy things to grow big antlers. Not just in Georgia, but all over the United States. But those same inputs that are causing that crazy antler growth do some really strange things sometimes to the tooth growth as well. And so it's just a little bit more complex to try to meter out an age, but we can always meter out an age. Oftentimes we have an age range associated with it because there's a little bit of what we consider abnormal histology. So we've got our aging models that we've compiled over the years, and we know that an animal is supposed to grow its tooth in a certain way. Well, the animals don't always know that. They didn't get our aging models. So some of them deposit the cementum a little bit differently, and it's just a little bit more challenging to try to figure out that pattern, but it's still a repeated pattern. And so we can still, again, plus or minus a year, we're pretty good at assigning ages, even at those most difficult species. But those are the most difficult species in some of those regions, and particularly for white-tailed deer. An elk from Alberta, Canada, that's going to be pretty easy to age. White-tailed deer from Florida, difficult. Mm-hmm. So that's just kind of the nature of nature, I suppose. And then you throw human influence on top of that, and that just complicates matters a little bit further.
Bingo. So this is a good segue now that you're talking. It's funny because I'm reading this study from 2000, which seems like forever ago. And I'm reading this quote: based on the number of incisors processed, it appears that Matson's laboratory at the time in Milltown, Montana, processes and ages most incisors collected in North America. How cool is that? That's 21 years ago. And again, my guests don't pay me, but I don't just pull anybody on the show to be a guest, so I'd have to think highly of you before having you on. But I think that's really cool. And at the time, I think they only reported 20,333 whitetails. So you've come a long way in 21 years.
We have, and it's pretty exciting, and I'm really glad that people, more and more people are paying attention to this stuff, and they're using it in their game management, whether, again, it's a private ranch or state game agency. We process samples from each of the 50 states, and I think all the provinces in Canada, as well as around the world. But as I mentioned before, there's still some people that have no idea what we do here. And that's why we're really excited to be involved in this podcast. And any chance that we get to do a little bit of public outreach or education, we want to do that not only because it's good for us, and obviously our bottom line, none of us would have a job if people weren't interested in this sort of thing. But as wildlife conservationists, we want the best research out there, and we want people to be making research decisions based on the best science. And so we pride ourselves on we're just a teeny, teeny, tiny component in that, but it's a steadfast component. We've been doing this year over year over year, and we're really proud to be members of this laboratory that kind of started it all way back in the 60s.
Yeah, so was it 69 that Gary started the lab? Can you kind of talk a little bit about, you own it now, correct?
True, yeah.
In 2014 you bought it?
I did. And as I mentioned before, as working as a biologist, and it's funny that you mentioned the Wildlife Techniques Manual, which I have open right now to the Cementum pages, which are just before the toothware pages.
Yeah, page 193.
And, I'm on page 189. That's Cementum, so 193 must be toothware. Yep, you're right.
Yeah, there you go.
And when I was in college is the first time that I got introduced to this method of aging animals. And I remember in our laboratory class, my professor, maybe it was a TA in a lab class, had a little set of slides, and I remember looking at them under the microscope thinking, these people are nuts. Like, I have no idea what they're looking at. I'm just going to put a number down. I'm just going to guess. I absolutely did not know what I was doing. Of course, maybe I wasn't paying as close attention in class as I should have been. But that was sort of my first introduction to Matson's laboratory. And as I mentioned, I've had friends that worked at the lab or worked in the wildlife lab in Bozeman, extracting teeth that were sent to Matson's. And then as a hunter, I assume it's pretty much the same throughout areas that have hunting, where there's hunter check stations set up, and you pull over and you've got a deer or elk in the back of your truck. The biologist always pulls a tooth and sends that tooth to Matson. So I've just always known about this. And as I sort of struck out on my own, I managed the Montana State University Extension Wildlife program for a number of years before I decided to start my own business. And during that period of time, I got to know Gary Matson personally. We're both pilots, and that's actually how I kind of struck up a conversation with him when I found out who he was. And and by now Gary's in his 70s, and he was already looking to turn the reins over. And I just started working with him, and eventually worked out a deal that would allow him to retire because he had earned it. But interestingly enough, Gary is still very much a part of the lab. And when we come across these species that we don't see very often, I'm still sending slides to Milltown, Montana to get a second opinion from Gary, because he's still knows more about this stuff than anyone living on the face of the earth, literally. It's Gary. So A.J. and I and the rest of us at the lab are so fortunate to be able to learn from the master himself, and I hold Gary in the highest esteem.
For sure. So I want to get into a little bit. I know we said we'd save some of the process, but I think it's important to understand how this works for people. So can you kind of get into, you don't have to get into the crazy details, but obviously most of us, from being inquisitive kids, probably remember running around the neighborhood and maybe somebody cut down an old maple tree on the sidewalk, and there you are counting the rings on the tree, trying to age it. Can you kind of explain the process of how this is done in the lab so that we get a basic sense?
Yep. So what I'm going to do to give AJ a chance to talk is I'm going to give my version, which is really hard and fast, and I'm going to let AJ hit some of the lab details because he's our mad scientist in the laboratory. So all mammals deposit this layer of what's called cementum around the root tip of their tooth. You can think of it as cementum because it cements the tooth into place. So as we grow and get older, teeth continue to extrude just a little bit, and that's where that saying long in the tooth comes from. As animals grow, the tooth continues to emerge, and this is at a microscopic level, obviously, out of the jawline. But as that tooth continues to emerge, it's depositing this little layer of cementum every year to hold it in place. Now, people that have bad teeth and animals that have bad teeth, they've got bad cementum, their teeth get loose and they fall out. It's the same way with, deer and elk as it is with people. If you don't have a healthy teeth and healthy mouth, you're going to lose your teeth, and it's because your cementum, something went horribly wrong in the growth cycle. And so for healthy animals, though, they're depositing this annual layer regularly, and what we're doing is taking a thin slice of that tooth, and it is not unlike a cross-section of a tree to look at those growth rings, those annual deposits. The biggest difference is we take a longitudinal section, so up and down instead of a true cross-section across, so we can see that entire root tip, and that's just to maximize visibility of those growth layers. But AJ, maybe you want to go a little bit more into the science?
Yeah, sure. You covered it pretty well there, Carolyn, but I guess just to kind of launch off of what she was saying, one of the things, we were talking about this yesterday when we were talking about doing this podcast. I think some people think, we make these sections, we put them on a slide, and then we put them in a scanner or something, and we get an age spit back out at us. And I used to use the analogy of it's kind of like driving a car, but I don't know if that analogy works anymore with technology going to driverless cars now. But it's very much, and that's why I think it's been so important for us that we've been so fortunate to work with Gary so closely to get these aging models down. But the simplest way to describe it is exactly like what you said, Carolyn was saying, with the tree rings. And yes, at the end of the day, counting rings, you can boil it down to that, but it's so much more than that. And like she said before, with the difference in animals between populations and even just animals themselves and how they lay that cementum down, there is an art in interpreting what 1 year's worth of growth is. And so you have to establish that in order to accurately assign the age, right? And so once you've established that, then you can begin your count. But if you can't establish, when Carolyn was talking about when she first looked at the slides in college, if you don't know what 1 year's worth of growth looks like, you're not going to know what 4 years worth of growth looks like.
Bingo. So can you kind of get into this? And I'm sitting here looking at a slide now, or a picture of one. So essentially, just to kind of draw the picture for the listeners, that you've got this thicker cementum, which is deposited during the summer months, right, when food resources are in massive abundance or close to that, and then you get these thin, dark bands that you call annuli that look like the tree rings. These are deposited in late winter, early spring. So at that point where critters are just, resources are low and critters are quite stressed. Is that kind of what we're looking at on the slide?
That's what we think we're looking at. But yes, we typically see this pattern of, a thick sort of light colored band followed by a thin dark colored band. And we think that the thick light colored band is deposited when things are good, animals got lots of nutrition, that cementum is rapidly expanding, and during wintertime, it's still growing, but it's so incremental that it ends up being just a dark line. And one of the reasons that we think this is primarily environmental, the interesting thing is, to this day, no one really knows what causes these bands to be deposited. It's all speculation. But black bears have beautiful annuli. Black bears in Montana or the northwestern part of the United States, they just have these thick light-colored bands and these really dramatic dark lines. And we think that those are, when the bear's hibernating. That's further supported by the fact that black bears in Florida or Georgia do not have such distinct lines and patterns, and they still have annual growth. And like I said, you can still usually establish a pattern. It's just not so light and dark. On the other hand, grizzly bears are also hibernating, and they oftentimes don't have such simple cementum deposits. So, it varies by region, it varies by species. It's definitely environmental and maybe a little bit physiological, but luckily for us, for whatever reason, they're making these annual deposits, and we're able to sort of interpret those under a microscope. And, this very, very small physical piece of evidence can be extrapolated to all kinds of game and wildlife management around the world. It's really cool that we're able to do that.
Yeah, that's neat. So what I gather, obviously, is that there is an art to it. It's not just something that you as you kind of alluded to when you were a student, you don't just slap this thing on the slide and, count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There's definitely an art. And if you could touch on that, and then also the different number of species that you guys have run through the lab. I'm just kind of interested in that myself.
Sure. Yeah, no problem. I can definitely attest to that. So, regarding the art, I'll start with that. You're absolutely right. People do think that this is an exact science, and like AJ said, we have some magic machine. We pop a tooth in, and then it prints out, some numbers on a piece of paper. That's not the case, and we've got a number of steps in the laboratory to prepare these teeth for the process. First, they need to be decalcified, and then we take that thin section, put it on a slide, stain it, and just the staining is an art in and of itself to be able to get the stains right, to get those rings to show up correctly. But the very last step is to put the slide on the microscope, and then the interpretation of the data on that slide is an absolute art form. And so, 99% of what we do is an exact science, but that last 1% is arguably the most important step, and that's all experience and interpretation, and that only comes with time and looking at lots of teeth. And AJ and I, even though we're relative newcomers to this, we've been doing it for, I think, 6 and 7 years respectively. We've both looked at hundreds of thousands of samples, and the only way to get really good at this is by looking at hundreds of thousands of samples. So it's pretty mind-boggling when you think about, again, the sheer numbers associated with what we do, and then thinking about, looking at tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of a species, and each one of those has a story behind it. And every once in a while we get to actually talk to the hunter that harvested the animal. By and large, most of the orders that we get come from a state fish and game agency. So we're getting hundreds to thousands of teeth at a time. And we're, running those through the lab, sending the data back to the biologists. They're using those to input into their, hunting date setting and quotas and things like that as they track their population management. But each one of those animals has a story behind it. So when we get, and sometimes we do, get hunters that come into the lab, we just had one yesterday, to drop off a sample in person, that's really cool. And we really treasure those moments as we hear the story behind the animal. We can't do that, 120,000 times a year. We just don't have the time. But the opportunities that we have, those few times a year that we get those, we really treasure them. It's kind of neat because, as I said, we're hunters, and I think of it when I'm looking at the slides. This is minutes of my time that I'm devoting to each of these samples to try to establish an age, but somebody spent an entire hunting season prepping for this and possibly tracking the animal, and finally, if they're lucky, being able to harvest it, and it's pretty incredible. And we've been on that end of the spectrum too, so yeah, we can attest to that. What was your other question? Because I think there were two.
As far as the different number of species.
Oh, sure. Yeah, absolutely. So we've done, I think, 2.7 million total, and that reaches across 150-some species at last count. So we receive teeth from all around the world, and again, the North American sort of game species are definitely our bread and butter. but we get a lot of other species, from other continents. We do animals from Africa. We do a number of different sort of species that are being monitored by NOAA, the National Oceanic. Yes, thank you. So walruses and sea otters and ringed seals and fur seals and all kinds of different seals and sea lions and things like that. And some of them are harvested animals. They're harvested as part of indigenous hunts or something like that. Mm-hmm. But a lot of them are just straight research. They're extracting a tooth. They're tracking these animals as they migrate. And again, these are animals that are migrating across oceans. So that's kind of cool that this little lab in Montana is helping to have a part in that. AJ works with a lot of sort of threatened and endangered species, and maybe you can speak to some of those.
Yeah, so I would say probably there's two really rewarding things about working here that I've found, and one of them, like Carolyn said, is that hunter that you get to interact with, and they've been following this buck for 3-4 years or whatever, and then they finally harvested, and then being able to report and confirm, or maybe it was older than they thought, or it was younger than they thought.
Argue with them.
That's really rewarding. Yeah. Well, it usually does end up being an argument.
Yeah.
But, and then the other aspect is absolutely these endangered species that we're dealing with, and so unfortunately, it's become very difficult to get the teeth into the United States, but we've worked tirelessly with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in order to continue to meet all the permitting and crossing all our T's and dotting our I's. But yeah, we've done recently, pretty much yearly, we've been doing the polar bears from Nunavut, Canada. So, with everything that's going on in the world and how that is relating to climate change, polar bears, unfortunately, they're very difficult to age. But when you're aging polar bears, I mean, it's literally a species that the whole world is concerned about. Some of the other things, probably the most rewarding species that I've ever got to work with was the Gobi brown bears, and so they live in the Gobi Desert. From what I gathered, they live on next to nothing, and just a little bit of research that I did, there's less than 35 of them that remain on the earth, and so that was, I think, in 2017 or 2018. A couple of years ago, we did a project for a guy that's monitoring them, and so it was really interesting because I expected, I think Carolyn alerted earlier, brown bears are typically on the more difficult end to age, but these Gobi brown bears, they laid down beautiful Cementum annual layers, and I was able to confidently assign the ages to them, and then I think that's one of the ones that we sent to Gary for checking, and we had excellent agreement. So it's just when you get those teeth, and especially from these species of critically endangered, they're high importance, I guess. I don't want to say one animal is more valuable than another, but when you only have so many of them left on Earth, and then to be able to assign ages and then be very, very confident in the ages that you're assigning, and that data is going to go to hopefully save this population, or at least get it back on track. I don't know what else could be as rewarding as that.
Yeah, that's pretty powerful. So I want to drill down. You mentioned that you had excellent agreement when you went to Gary. I was curious how, and maybe get into this confidence code a little bit. How often do you guys get into knockdown, drag out arguments in the lab over age?
I'll start, and then Carolyn can wrap up. But so we have, I would say, I started in 2015. In the first year, at least, everything was getting checked by Gary, and so there is a very, very steep learning. And so we have pretty strict, stringent protocols in the lab before we actually, put people on teeth and start allowing them to age animals. And so most of what you're talking about, most of that is getting worked out in the training process. And so, I'm seeing 2, you're seeing 4. We're going to knock that out early on, and we're going to get on the same page and go forward. And then you want to talk about agreement and a confidence coefficient. And so, yeah, standard, once we're aging, we check at least 10%, sometimes more, depending on the population of each other's orders. So, if I age an order of bears, at least 10% of those are going to get checked by another individual in the lab that's certified to age bears as well. And so typically what we're seeing there for a good population, or when I say good, I mean easy to age population, we're not going to see those drastic differences. It's going to be a difference of a range. And so, I might have assigned it 2 to 3, and they might have assigned it 2 to 3. So at the end of the day, the data set's going to remain very similar. And it does come down to that interpretation component that Carolyn talked about. And so we have, a list of characteristics. And so we do our absolute best to try to kind of have a standardized model, which we've developed for all of the major huntable species, like elk, deer, black bears, et cetera. And so, when do you assign the higher age? When do you assign the lower age? We have a set of specific requirements, but there are always going to be those individuals where it can, this is either a 2 or a 3-year-old. There's equal evidence for both. So there isn't necessarily a right or a wrong. And so I would say that that's pretty rare if we're going to get into, we don't ever argue, I wouldn't say that, but there's very rarely large discrepancies between us. And then if there is, then that's usually when that's happening, that's with a brand new species like we've never aged before. So right now we have in the lab, we have some nilgai from Texas. Mm-hmm. And so we're kind of working with the individual that submitted those to figure out, the most important thing for all of our aging models is figuring out, especially for the ungulates, is what that first annulus represents. So most oftentimes it's 2, but it can be, especially with the different tooth types, if they're not the first incisor, if they're some of the other incisors, those are erupting much later. So that first annulus could be representative of year 3 or 4. And then going back to earlier what Carolyn was saying with some of the marine mammals, walruses are really interesting just because the teeth are so big. Those rings, the first few rings don't actually come down. And since the tooth is so big, we can't get as much of the tip on the slide as we can with the smaller tooth. And so the first ring that actually goes around the root tip is actually year 5. So that's just something that we've learned over the years, and that, like Carolyn said, once you've aged 100,000 teeth, then you start to get good at it. So I don't know if you want to add in on that at all, Carolyn, about agreement and the confidence coefficients.
No, I think that you covered it pretty well. If any of the listeners actually send samples to us, and I certainly hope you do, thank you. Sometimes you'll see that you'll get an A, B, or C rating, and that's that certainty code that Jason's talking about. So we've got these models that we build in-house. Again, a 3-year-old mule deer is supposed to look like this. If it doesn't quite look like that, if it looks like something else, we might assign a B or C code. So some animals are beautiful. It's a 5-year-old animal. It couldn't be 4 and it couldn't be 6. It's 5, it meets all our criteria, and we'll assign it an age of 5 with A as a certainty code. If it looks like it's probably 5, but there's some stuff going on, that there might be an annular component or something in there that we're misinterpreting, maybe it's only 4, we'll assign a code of B and maybe give it an age of 4B, 4 to 5, and that B indicator is sort of a match of how well what we see on the side correlates with our standard age model for that species. So if it's an A, you can be really confident that age is correct. If it's a B, then the correct age might be plus or minus a year. And the nice thing about what we do is that we admit that we could be wrong. And not only do we admit that the age could be wrong, but we give the customer an idea of which direction we could be wrong in. So if it's a 4B, 4 to 5, we say, well, we think it's 4, but it could be a year older. Or we might say a 4B, 3 to 4. Well, we think it's 4, but it could be a year younger. So not only are we providing that sort of estimate of error, but it's also directional. We tell you what the age range could be. And sometimes we get something that's really bizarre, really abnormal histology. This usually happens if the animal's under some sort of severe physiological stress, disease, drought, something like that. And sometimes these animals actually, their teeth start reabsorbing, particularly when nutrients are lacking, and a lot of that cementum just isn't there. And so that's typically when you'll see a C rating. And I mean, this animal, it could be 3, it could be 7. We just don't know because there's just not enough material there to make a good assumption on age. But again, we'll let you know that. So we try to do our best to provide obviously the best ages, but when they're less than the best, we let you know that too. So you can feel really good about, if you really thought this animal was 4 years old and we said, well, it's 3 to 4, you know what? It was probably 4. But if you really thought the animal was 8 and we said it was 3 to 4, that's where some of those conversations come into play. And we have had them. But in the end, all we can do is assign the best age based on the evidence that we are seeing. And that's not to say that we're right 100% of the time. As AJ said, 4 to 15% of the time, we might be off by a year. But we try to let you know when that's the case also. Yeah,
that's good stuff. And obviously, nature's nature, right? Everything and anything can be, way off the norm and the average at any point in time. So obviously, we expect that, but if I wrote a script for this podcast, I swear you guys would have it, and I didn't, and you don't. But you mentioned when you said you hit something here that clients and I have had this discussion over many, many times. In fact, I just sent one a text last night about it because I wanted to bring it up and I want him to listen to this. You mentioned that the hunter thought or your customer thought that the animal was 3 or 4, whatever. So if I'm sending in samples, and we'll get into the tooth type here in a minute. You also mentioned that. And I think that it's called a whitetail because that's what I've been chasing. I've been chasing him for 5 years, and maybe I think he's 6.5 at this point, or 4.5, whatever. Should I tell you that? And the reason I ask, sort of a loaded question, the reason I ask you that is because I've seen some data from other labs, and there was a questionnaire. And I love science. Like when people talk about COVID-19 and we're going to follow the science, and I sit here and I look at the science, and it's nothing like mainstream media is reporting. So it's a real trip. People, you're not following the science. When I saw this, that they were asking, yeah, right. They were asking for the customer to say, I think he's 3.5. I was like, are you kidding me? You're paying for this? So do you ask us what we think the buck's 4.5 years old when we send in our questionnaire?
No, that's to be honest, it's a bit ridiculous. And here's why. There are inherent biases, and I know because I age my own personal animals. And if I shoot an animal and I think it's really old, it's going to be really hard to not assign it that older age when I'm looking at the slide. No matter how unbiased I think I am, you just can't get away from that.
Yeah.
And so we never want to know the ages, the estimated ages. Maybe it was estimated by tooth wear or years that somebody caught it on a game camera, or, who knows where people come up with their estimates. But we would prefer to not know any of that. That's the best way that you're going to get an unbiased age. And there have been times that somebody's got some really good evidence of an age that's different than what we assigned. I don't want to know it until afterwards. And if there's good evidence there, I'll always want to take another look because who knows, maybe there is something that I missed. Mm-hmm. But the first time I do an age assignment, I want it to be blind, essentially. And a lot of the times, when we are checking each other's work or sending slides back and forth for a new species, we independently blindly age both sets so that we can go back and that none of the agers are biased by what one of the agers, already thought the animal was. And so to me, that's really important. And if you're not doing that, it really isn't science. And there's all kinds of ways you can estimate the ages of an animal. And I'm not downplaying any of the ways anybody else uses, but this is the best way for us. And I think it's what's kept us sort of at the top of the pile. We don't have any, these sort of preconceived notions of an age of an animal, and we are only assigning the age based on the growth layers in the tooth. Mm-hmm. As you know, so many of those other factors can be misleading. So we want to just stick to what we see, what we know we're good at, and if somebody, thinks we're wrong because they have some other evidence, I'd love to hear about it, but we're never going to assign an age other than what we see when we're looking at that sample under a microscope.
Bingo.
Yeah,
Okay.
just to kind of add a little bit more there, I think, what you were talking about, I think that's can get lost, especially with the way, you see science presented in the media and in the mainstream. There's typically a narrative that people want to have. And so, I guess the question I would ask the audience is are you wanting to confirm what you thought? Like, if that's really important to you, then providing the data or the age that you think the animal was when you harvested it and biasing the age, you're probably going to be proven right, so to speak, more often. Because if you tell me, hey, I have trail pics for the last 6 years of this deer, right away, we're probably not going to age that animal less than 6 years old, right? But if you're more concerned in learning and getting an unbiased age, then we're the lab to send it to. And I think, I don't want to go too far down the rabbit trail, but unbiased science is true science, right? We don't set out with any preconceived notions on we're trying to prove that this animal was 5 or we're trying to prove that this animal was 4 because that's what, the rack size. And I believe we're probably talking about the same lab without naming names, but they ask for quite a bit of information, the rack size, how old you think it is, et cetera, et cetera. And so when you put those biases out the gate to start, in my opinion, that's taking away a large part of the unbiased science aspect, which, in my opinion, and Carolyn would definitely agree, is true science. And that's where we've kind of set our bars. We're not going to go down that rabbit trail. We're going to apply the methods that work. They work 85% of the time for a good population of white-tailed deer. And so if there's those 15% that aren't matching, chances are they're probably going to be off by a year if they're off. And then, like she said, if we're not certain, we're going to give you an age range. And so if you have those trail camera pics for 5 years and we aged it 4B, 4 to 5, go with the age that matches your evidence. You leave the interpretation up to the individual. That's not what we're about. That makes sense.
Absolutely. And I've had some clients say, okay, I'm going to keep using this lab, but I'm not going to answer this question. And they actually reach out to them and ask them, how old do you think this animal was? And I'm like, this is sort of like me saying, all right, I'm going to do your IQ. Give me your money and tell me what you think your IQ should be or is. And if you're buying something, there's nothing better than, telling people what they want to hear, right? As a consultant, the first thing I tell my clients is, I hope you're okay with getting a little bit uncomfortable when I tell you I think you're doing some things wrong, and I'm only doing it because you're paying me to say that, right? So, all right, we can put that to bed. The first time I saw that, I lost it. I was like, this is not science. You want to talk about bias 101? It's just like the mask science. I know you guys don't have to comment on this, but I've taken this mask thing to the extreme because they're just destroying people's lives, including my kids. That there was supposedly this double mask research done, and I couldn't find it. So finally a client of mine who's a very good doctor found the study, and they had done it double masked mannequins. I kid you not, they double masked mannequins. and if that doesn't make you, raise your eyebrows, and you just don't understand science, so you need to stop listening to it. But so let's move on to tooth type. So here's another fun thing I like to do with clients. They'll call me up and they're so excited to take a tooth out, right? We've talked about the extraction process. With a lot of them, I either showed them in person or emailed them a picture that has dotted lines or perforations, cut here, be careful, do this. They call me up and hey man, I killed this really good buck. And I'm like, oh, congratulations. Tell me about it. Asking all these, facts about the hunt, what time, blah, 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 what plot, where at. No. And they're really not interested in that. They're just so excited to get that tooth out. So at this point they're hyped up. I'm hyped up. I'm like, all right, listen, so I want you to take the primary incisors on the top, the top of the deer's mouth, the jaw, the top. And it's quiet for the longest time, and you can just tell. And it's really hard to let them do this. And then you hear, he doesn't have teeth on the top. And it's so entertaining because a lot of people don't realize it until they actually look that there are no incisors on the top. So I just let the cat out of the bag on my joke. But what teeth are we pulling for whitetails? And then I guess you can kind of briefly touch, even though we're over over our hour, how that might change with the more common game species like black bears and of course elk and muley are the same, but go.
Yeah, so for ungulates across the board, it's those first two incisors. And so when we usually refer to those in the lab as the I1, I standing for incisor, 1 standing for the first incisor. And so if you're looking at the lower jaw, because like you said, deer don't have teeth on their upper jaw or incisors on their upper jaw or mandible. Anyways, so it's those two bottom incisors that are on each. If you have the jaw, I think most of your listeners are probably familiar. You can kind of break it in half, and so it's the tooth on either side of where that jaw joins. So those are the teeth that we use for deer, all species, mule deer, blacktail, etc. Use those for elk, sheep, goats, any ungulate. That's what we're going to need. So that's pretty easy to remember. For most carnivores, that's where it kind of gets kind of tricky. Most carnivores, we're going to look at the canine. So if you harvest a bobcat or a coyote, we really like to have that canine tooth. The exceptions to that are kind of the black bears. We use the first premolar, which is actually the tooth right behind the canine, and that's what all the biologists are sending us. One, it's a very small tooth, and so hunters aren't getting upset that their skull is going to be missing a large tooth because it's not even noticeable once it's pulled. And then two, that also provides what we found to be the best ages from black bears. And so then the other species that we do age quite a bit for these agencies are the fishers and martens, and those typically we're requesting the fourth premolar. And so that's actually a double-rooted tooth, and for whatever reason, those typically provide the best evidence. And to kind of go back to answer your question, why is this important? And so one of the things that Gary spent a lot of time doing was developing these what we call standard aging models. And so he spent a lot of time figuring out which teeth are going to yield the best results. And so these are the teeth that have proven, not 100% of the time, but the majority of the time, these are going to be the teeth that provide the best ages. And that's especially true with deer teeth. As you start going out from that first incisor, so somebody's like, well, what if I shot a deer and it was missing its front two incisors? That happens, and it is possible. So then you can take the next incisor, the second incisor, the third, and on out. But what happens, and you can see this if you pull all the teeth, those teeth get smaller, and the cementum deposition is just, when you're looking at it under the microscope, it becomes a lot more scrunched a lot of times, and then the annuli, for whatever reason, just aren't as clear and distinct. Another reason that it's important is I mentioned that earlier, is those eruption times. And so if somebody sends us a third incisor, usually we can tell the difference, between a first and a third incisor, or even a first and a second. It does get difficult, though, if you send us a tooth, because you got to remember, we're just getting a tooth in an envelope. It's out of the jaw. We have no idea where it was pulled from. We're just literally looking at this tooth, and we have our in-house references. But if it's an older animal and the teeth are worn down, because we use the crown primarily to tell the tooth type, and so if it gets processed through as a standard tooth, say in a mule deer, it gets processed as an I1, and it ends up being a different tooth type, we can actually, that messes up the age because the other teeth are coming in at a later date, and so that first annulus, in whitetail, the first annulus is indicative of year one for an incisor. For a first incisor, excuse me. But if it was actually an I2 or an I3 and we didn't catch that, and somebody didn't let us know, we're going to age that the same way we would an I1, except that those later incisors aren't coming in until after year one, so that first annulus is actually year two. So we're going to underage it. Does that make sense?
It did. You know what's more important from all that is, AJ, we're so appreciative that you're there in the lab doing all this for us.
Oh, yeah. Well,
that's a lot.
Our job. We like doing it.
Yeah, that's awesome. So I wanted to get into the collection process. So I know you said, a lot of times you get one tooth. So I'll tell folks to use the little coin envelopes like you alluded to. And I always tell clients or whoever asks about it to take both incisors and send them in case they screw one up, because, and I know, I have several clients who are dentists or orthodontists. I suspect they'll be pretty darn good at this extraction process. Although I watched one work on my son, I'm pretty sure I could have done better with a come along myself. But most of these dentists are really good at it. So do you recommend sending both of them in case we screw one up? And then can you kind of talk about, so, some people think you take that actual tooth like imagine your kid's losing a tooth and taking that tooth out. Explain the difference between the tooth and actually having the root, and where if we were to screw up and make your job difficult in the extraction process, where would that be?
Where people screw up most of the time, and it's frustrating to me because I've had close friends of mine, and I do the teeth as a favor, and I go over how to extract it. I'll send them. There's a YouTube video. We've have one, and then Vermont has a really good one. It's like 1 minute long, and it's super easy to extract a tooth in the field from a freshly killed, or even the next day, as long as it doesn't freeze. But where people always go wrong is they grab it with a pair of pliers and they just pry. And what happens? The crown breaks off, and you're left with a crown and a very small portion of root. And with deer especially, it's very important to get the entire root, because the best cementum is at the root tip, which is the very bottom of the tooth, right? And so if we don't have that, if we only have the crown and a small portion of the root, we won't even process it, because there's just not going to be, it's not worth our time, and we don't want to waste somebody's money. We kind of have a cutoff. It's about 2/3 or 3/4 of the root. We'll process it. But that's what you want to do when you're processing it, or when you're extracting it, is you just want to make sure you take your time. And you can do it with, all you need is a knife. You cut down on both sides as far as you can go, and then you flip the knife over, and as long as you're using a spine knife, and you just use the spine of the knife to kind of gently pry it out. And if you're having to really work at it, just stop, right? Because once you cut down on the gum, and then you can scrape some of the gum away in the front too, it'll come right out.
Yeah. So when my cousin's an ER doc, and I used to have him get me some scalpels, because that's what I always used. And then when Havalon and others came out with those real thin blades, I found that they worked pretty good. Not for the prying, but I tend to keep cutting those 3 cuts, probably a lot longer than most, because I just want to keep working it until it comes all the way out. But so that's good stuff.
You can actually, if you cut down enough, you can actually usually I can get it out with my thumb.
Yeah.
So if you get it loose enough, I mean, it's no different than, you're basically loosening the tooth and causing the animal to lose it. But
absolutely. Well, we're already at 1 hour and 21, and I feel like we could go on all day. So we'll slowly wrap this up. So obviously my goal is to get more people to send teeth to the lab. Mine actually now go with my taxidermist, which is really cool. I don't even see the teeth anymore. He extracts them, sends them all in a big batch, and I think all taxidermists should do this. Can you kind of touch on how do we go on the website? How can they get a hold? How do they submit a sample? If you want to talk about cost, I'll leave all that up to you, but let's teach them how they can do it now, or tell them how.
Yeah, absolutely. So first off, our website is a great resource, and it's got not only all the instructions on submitting a sample, but an awful lot of information. If you're interested in some of the science behind what we do, we've got, literature that we've been featured in and things like that on the website. You can spend a lot of time if you want to learn about cementum analysis, but probably what most people are interested in is just sending us a tooth. So on the website, we've got a tab for hunters and outfitters, and the website is www.matsonslab.com. You can click on hunters and outfitters and general information, and I'm doing this as I talk, so I'm leading you down the right path. There's an order form for hunters, outfitters, and taxidermists, so that's probably what you guys have been using to send teeth in. And all the information that we will need from you is right there, and primarily what we need is your contact information. If you need more material on which tooth to extract or how to prepare the tooth for shipment, you'll also find that on our webpage under extractions and shipping. We've got lists of the standard tooth type. So if you're not sure which tooth to submit for the species that you're sending, all that information is there, as well as links to those extraction videos. So that's really a tremendous resource. If you're sending us a tooth, or if you just want to know more about the science, there's an awful lot there on that website. For our typical orders, I'll just go ahead and tell the pricing. Our minimum lab fee is $75, and we do process up to 5 teeth for that amount. So if you get together with a few of your, hunting buddies or something like that, if you've only got one tooth, you might as well get 5 done for the same price. And you can either send payment in with your teeth, or we'll bill you once we receive it in the lab. If you are an agency researcher or biologist, and you're sending hundreds of teeth at a time, we do have custom pricing for those. And please feel free to contact the lab, and we'll be happy to put a quote together for you. But I guess those are about the ABCs. AJ actually checks the samples into the lab. Is there anything I'm missing that you'd like to add?
No, I think she hit all the points there. And one thing, I'll just go back. It's highly preferable to receive just teeth and not an entire jawbone. Like I mentioned, it's if you watch the video that's on our website, it's a YouTube video that the Vermont their wildlife agency put out. It's like 1 minute long, and as long as the deer is fresh and it's not frozen, it's super easy to extract your teeth. And once you do it once, you're like, wow, this is super easy. But what happens if you cut the jaw out and you let it dry? It becomes like leather, and then we get, and that's fine. Well, we can definitely process these, but we do charge for extractions, and so it's way harder to extract these teeth once they've dried in the jaw, because then what we have to end up doing is soaking them in warm water with a mild detergent, and then we have to end up extracting them. So I would just encourage clients just to send us teeth, and it's also going to save them on postage. And then, like you said, if you wanted to keep that jawbone for a display, then you have it, and you have the entire jawbone intact, and you can do that. And one other thing, kind of going back, I think that was in the beginning of the podcast when you were talking about displaying the jawbone, is we do offer age certificates. So if this was like a special hunt, or maybe you drew an elk tag and you came out west and shot an elk, or if this is just a special deer to you that you've been following. I just had an email from a guy yesterday, and he'd been following a deer for 8 years. And so, yeah, we offer age certificates that we can print out and put the age on it, and we can send it, and you guys can display that with your mount as well. So I think that pretty much covers everything. Did you want to talk about the promo code?
Yeah,
we kind of wanted to offer something. Carolyn will go into that.
Yeah, we very much appreciate being a part of your show today, Jason. And for your listeners, what I'd like to offer, with your permission, is if you do submit an order to Matson's Laboratory, we'd like to send a free Matson's hat. Just use the promo code Drop-Tine, so we know that you heard about us through this podcast. And we just got some new hats in with our new Bobcat Skull logo. They look pretty cool. Just let us know if you want a flat brim or a traditional ball cap, and we'll get one sent your way. Just use that promo code Drop-Tine with your order when you send it in.
That's awesome. Super appreciate that. That's just DROPTINE, no hyphen or anything, just all lowercase?
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, good deal. Well, I don't have a hat.
You'll be getting one. I'm telling you, we just got them in. We just got them last week, so we're excited to get those into circulation, and we're really happy to partner with other sort of like-minded conservationists. So
absolutely.
So really happy to be a part of your show today and share some of our science.
Well, we appreciate it, and it's been a long time. We've been trying. AJ, you're super patient. I'm glad we nailed it down. To be honest with you, I'm really surprised that no one else has had you on the podcast, because, and this is where I acknowledge you guys for doing what you do. I mean, just I know a lot of people don't read the research I read, but just taking the hunters and the landowners and managers and those who lease property, without knowing with relative certainty the age of these animals, and it could be does as well. For a lot of my clients, we get just as excited over doe ages as bucks. We really appreciate you guys, all the work you've done. Looking at 100,000 samples and honing your craft, we super appreciate it, and it allows us, some of those bullet points I hit on in the beginning, and I could go on all day for reasons we need to know age, and obviously looking at antler size and antler variation and antler restrictions and the whole 9 yards, high grading, perpetual protection. None of that, all that would just be a pipe dream without having that age estimate. So thank you so much for that. Thanks for coming on. And if you guys have anything else one more thing you want to wrap up with, that's good. If not, I think we're at that point, and I can close up after that.
That sounds like a plan. I think I'm good. Again, just appreciate you having us, and And thanks to everyone for the teeth they've been sending in over the years so we can keep doing this.
Yeah, thanks for you being patient as well and taking the time to put this together, Jason. It's been great, and I look forward to listening to it whenever you get it done. But yeah, appreciate everything, so thanks a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. Perfect. Well, good deal. With that, I am going to make a quick announcement for those of you who've listened to the whole thing here to the end. And I'll kind of leak more of this out as we go, but I've got a relationship with actually is a client of mine. Some of you may know them from some of their television shows. Chris and Casey Kiefer, who did the crazy successful Dropped show, Project Alaska, and the whole 9 yards. And then they've been on, other channels, Outdoor Channel, you name it. Those two are clients of mine, and I don't talk about clients unless they want me to. But they recently picked up a property in southern Illinois that we just kicked off. They're interested in soil health. They're interested in the whole 9 yards of making this property a truly world-class place. So just wanted to kind of drop. I'm going to have those guys on soon. We'll talk about this project. I appreciate them allowing me to talk about it. And obviously being on television, they're going to show the whole process. And we just did a podcast when I was out there. I admit there was quite a bit of bourbon involved. But if you go to the Humanimal podcast, they just started the podcast. They just launched an incredible website. We're going to be doing a lot of educational content, not YouTube, exponentially cooler and better than YouTube. These guys are so talented when it comes to filming and storytelling. They're incredible guys. I'm super excited. So check out the Humanimal. I believe it's iamhumanimal.com on the website. There's going to be Humanimal U, where they're going to go to experts in the field, whether it's Winchester and long-range shooting. I'm going to cover the habitat, the herd, obviously the regenerative ag, the soil health, all the goodies related to developing properties for deer. So again, just kind of dropping that for now, and we'll talk more about it. So anyway, I'm going to leave you guys with a song. I know country radio doesn't really play country anymore, so I picked one of my favorites to leave on. Appreciate you guys.
Appreciate you.
If heaven ain't a lot like Dixie, I don't want to go. If heaven ain't a lot like Dixie, I just as soon stay home. I was one of the chosen few to be born in Alabama. I'm just like my daddy's son. I'm proud of who I am. I went through a lot of good women and shook old Jim Beam's hand. If I never see the pearly gates, I've walked through the promised land. If heaven ain't a lot like Dixie, I don't want to go. If heaven ain't a lot like Dixie, I just as soon stay home. If they don't have a Grand Ole Opry like they do in Tennessee, just send me to hell or New York City. It would be about the same to me. I got wild honey trees and crazy little weeds growing around my shack. These dusty roads ain't streets of gold, but I'm happy right where I'm at. All these pretty little southern belles are a country boy's dream. They ain't got wings or halos, but they sure look good to me. If heaven ain't a lot like Dixie, I don't want to go. If heaven ain't a lot like Dixie, I just as soon stay home. If they don't have a Grand Ole Opry like they do down in Tennessee, just send me to hell or New York City. It would be about the same to me.